Hey, this episode of the Adventist Millennial Podcast is sponsored by The Haystack. The Haystack is a voice for young adults in the Seventh-day Adventist Church that produces articles, music reviews, videos, and more. What's the and more? Well, you'll have to go to their website to find out. thehaystack.org. The Haystack. Life, culture, theology.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. You're listening to 101.7 Smooth Adventist Jazz.
Guys, welcome back to the podcast. I have an exciting interview for you today, as you heard in the teaser. But first, I just wanted to say thanks for listening. I appreciate each and every one of you. And if you're enjoying this podcast, review it on iTunes, Adventist Millennial Podcast. Leave me a little review. Also, if you want to get in touch with me at all, follow me on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook, or email me, adventistmillennial@gmail.com. Search for me at SDA Millennial. That's my Twitter handle and my Instagram handle. Also, don't forget, we have the Adventist Millennials Slack space that you can always come and join if you have questions, comments, thoughts, things to ponder, theological predicaments, cultural nuggets, nougats, just things like that. There are ways to create community if you so choose, and we would be glad to have you. For now, let's jump into this incredible interview, and I will let them introduce themselves. I want to thank you for being here, but I know who you are, but not everyone knows who you are. So could you just tell us, about a little bit about yourselves.
I'm Emily's cousin, her favorite cousin. I hope none of the rest of you are listening to refute that. My name is Olivia. I grew up in Texas with Emily and then moved a bunch of places that none of you really probably care to know. And I am a millennial.
Great. Nice to meet you for the first time ever on this podcast.
And my name's Graham, and I am married into this family of Webbers. I am a millennial as well, born and raised in California, so don't judge me because that hasn't shaped my views at all.
So, as you probably know on this podcast, I like to talk with people about kind of their experience within the church, within Adventism specifically, and see what have been our struggles, what have been the things that have been meaningful to us, why are we seeing the trends that we're seeing now. And so really I just want to sort of get your experience and find out what's your life been like, and maybe smoke a doobie. Just kidding, we're not going to do that. This is the Adventist Millennial Podcast.
Not the California way.
Well,
it's not legal here.
We have a lot to say.
Okay,
mostly
good.
Graham.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so
just
I guess
set me up.
The first thing is just kind of, can you tell us what your Adventist journey has been like? I've talked about on here, I've gone through sort of different phases. Like, I went through a really fundamentalist phase, and then I went through a get out of my face, I don't care about religion phase. Like, what has your journey been like through your life?
I guess probably the best way to put it is I'm a multi-generational Adventist. So, it started with my great-grandmother and just kind of cycled on down. I did the whole Adventist education. So I started in 6th grade and went through college with the Adventist education. And I think my biggest struggle is I've struggled to make religion real. I think that's probably been the hardest thing for me, is I've gone to church relatively regularly throughout my life. And at times I felt like, as soon as I'm out from my parents' roof, religion is not going to be part of my life. But I feel like it's something that is important, and I can tell the difference in my life when I do make a better effort with religion, and how it's just, I think the gap for me has been, it hasn't ever felt truly real, and it hasn't been my own real experience.
Yeah. And then you got yourself roped back in.
I did. That I did.
Okay, so my journey. I feel like my journey's been kind of all over the place too. Started out same as both of you, I think, really going to church. We really hardly ever didn't go to church. We'd skip every once in a blue moon, but really went to church most Sabbaths. When I was 9, decided that we should read together as a family through the Bible. That really made things more personal for me. I started having personal devotions. I went through a very devout phase as probably, I would say my biggest like most devout phase was probably as a mid-teenager, so 14 to 17 or something. It kind of blows my mind now. Like, I'm much worse as an adult. I would have lengthy devotions, prayer and Bible study, and was really devout. And went through a very intensive like youth evangelism program, and was really on fire, preached in evangelistic meetings, like several different ones, did tons of mission trips, and then went to college and hit real life and really struggled to kind of find my place. Not like I differ a little bit in that I've never really struggled with, am I an Adventist? That's not something that I have really struggled with, but struggling with making it personal and making it real. And so I started getting tired like adults do. I started getting busy. I struggled to find a church that felt like a fit for me, that felt fulfilling. Continue to struggle with that through graduate school. And really my devotional life has continued to, in my mind, get worse and worse and worse to where can you hear that out there? Okay, well, wait a minute.
He's just really thirsty.
Hey, enough.
That's funny.
Back to my journey. No, I don't even know how you can edit that. So basically, picking up with college, struggled to find a fit, continued that through graduate school. My devotional life has continued to be a big struggle for me, more because I'm tired than that I don't want to. They say we all have time, but I struggle to make the time. And then now, being an adult, being out of a college town, really struggle with just making it a daily real experience, because it is still important to me, but...
So, you kind of touched on it, but, like, where do you stand now in relation, not only in your personal sort of religious walk, but in relation to the church as a whole? I know you said you haven't necessarily struggled with your identity as an Adventist, but I think we all have some relation to the church as an organization. Where do you see yourself?
For me, I feel like church has been a situation where it's something that we do on a regular basis. It's, our 9 to noon Saturday morning type situation, and then we go, and then we either go out to potluck or family picnic or whatever, and then we kind of go off and do our own thing. And so we've kind of really boxed the religion in that way. So I don't, that's kind of how I feel, as I struggle that the box might not be my box anymore.
Yeah.
Making it real.
Yeah. So I think a lot of people feel that way. Is there anything you can envision that would be different, that would be a better fit? Because I have talked to a lot of people who have said, like, yeah, I don't feel like it's really relevant to me or resonating with me, but we struggle to come up with, okay, what would be? Do you have any ideas?
That's a good question. I'm trying to think of, I don't even know. I think some of it ties back to just making a personal commitment that I want to be involved. And I think if you come and expect, this is my sprinkling of blessing for that week type situation, and expect other people to kind of be the blessing versus you kind of taking it on in your own heart, I think that might help change the mindset maybe. But I guess that also takes a personal commitment.
Do more or less picnics have anything to do with it?
If they were more like, if beef was back in the equation,
right.
then it would be a big change for a lot of people.
But then we would all smell like beef.
Well, I was going to touch on the social aspect of that too, like, because Emily and I have had a lot of discussions where if we were to repeat all of our thoughts on here, it could be like a 10-hour podcast, mostly because I like to talk a lot. Oops. No, but the social aspect of it, I think that, like, you were sharing with me, Emily, about how it's hard because we put a lot of blame on, like, oh, you have to be the change. Like, if you don't like it, you better get involved. And I do think, involvement has been a big blessing and has made a difference in my life. But I also think I have struggled, just to be completely real, I have struggled going to church and feeling like, this is probably taboo to say, but, like, I don't really have anything in common with this particular congregation. Or you're in a congregation I've been in both, where you're in a congregation that's so big that it's hard to find the people that you connect with. And part of that, I feel like, is we're very selfish and we just want to be with the people we want to be with and we don't want to work with others. But part of that is I think there's good and bad with that, because I think it's also that part of it is we need to push ourselves out of our comfort zone, but we also, like, I think it's okay sometimes to need to just rest and be with people that uplift us. So I think that that's a hard balance to find as well, which affects our whole church experience.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, and that's something that I wanted to ask you about. Like, I think that we've both kind of had experience in the different geographical sections of the church. Like, we've both been in Adventist college towns with big churches and lots of Adventists around. And then there's also the places like where our grandparents live, where there's one church and there's a handful of people, and if you don't like those people or you don't get along with those people, you're either going to a church that is really tough to go to or you're not going. So what in your mind, what are the sort of unique struggles of each sort of life? Because like you said, right now I live in a college town. I live in Loma Linda. There's so many Adventists everywhere you turn.
And a million churches.
Yeah, and yet people still complain that they can't find community because it's like being lost in a crowd almost. But then on the other hand, you have like, well, there's Buck, and that's the only person I can be friends with. Like, what have you seen living sort of in both areas?
Well, I hope you can edit this, because like I said, I get very long-winded and I have a lot to say about this. No, I really have, I feel like, seen a very, very broad spectrum of different types of Adventists, not even churches, but situations, like different. I feel like I've lived in 2 different Adventist meccas, going to an Adventist college and then an Adventist graduate school. And then now we kind of live in the middle of nowhere and go to a really small, tiny church. So, I feel like the struggles. So back when I was at Southern, back when I was in college, we used to joke like, man, there's so many Adventist churches. It's so hard to choose. And yet I've spent at least a full year church hopping and trying different churches and never really finding a fit for me, and really struggling with what did that mean, looking for a fit. Should I just be, like Graham said, should I just be forcing myself to commit and get involved even though I didn't like a church, or should I keep looking for a church that was a fit? And then my parents moved and I would drive an hour to go to their church with them because it just, at least I had the family element, which and they had a Sabbath school that was really biblically interesting and fulfilling to me. So then I go to graduate school, and Loma Linda, which is where you are, again, tons of churches, and yet I also really face the struggle of feeling alone, because if you go to the really big churches, does anybody even say hi to you? And then you could argue, well, maybe you need to be the one to say hello, but when you're not really comfortable and you're not really sure, it was kind of a vulnerable, like, I don't know, figuring out where I stood with the church, not as an Adventism, but just going to church regularly. And then if I went to some of the smaller churches, I felt like, well, I didn't really connect there. And then finally, right before we moved, Graham and I found a really, it's actually a Sabbath school, but we treated it like a church that we felt fulfilled by. We really were challenged by it. We loved it. And then we found out we were moving. So that's really probably the most I have felt like I fit at a church since I was a kid. And then now the unique struggle where we are here, I feel like I want to be careful how I say stuff, because I feel like everybody that we interact with is super genuine, and we've had nothing but positive social interactions here. Everybody at our church that we're at now has been so welcoming and friendly and kind, but it's really different. It's really, our pastor has a lot of churches. Instead of being like a head pastor at a big church, he has a lot of churches, so he's not always there. And everybody does the very best that they can to share a sermon or things like that. But it's really different. It's more of I feel like we've had to put ourselves in more of okay, how can we be a blessing? How can we be involved rather than going to sit and absorb a blessing? And it's been hard in some weeks, if I'm being completely honest, to even want to get up and go, because we're adults, we're tired. We drive to go to church. I don't know, it's been kind of a struggle to feel like, well, there's not going to be much happening there this week. Maybe we should just skip instead of, and it's almost been, I feel bad saying it, but we've almost had to force ourselves some weeks to be like, okay, no, we want to do this because we want to make it a priority. but it hasn't come natural. And we finally are getting more involved, and we're helping with some things, and it's making a big difference. But so I know that was really long-winded, but I guess to sum it all up, in a big area, I struggled with finding somewhere where I felt like I could connect with people and be seen and heard. And then now I struggle with the motivation to go, even when I feel like there may or may not be much going on at church that week.
Yeah.
I think it's a similar experience in both places for me. I mean, we went from being, like Olivia said, in Loma Linda that had tons of Adventists, had tons of church options, but it was still never a real experience. And so whether it's a big church or a small church, for me, it's a similar experience because it struggled to have meaning.
And that's a huge legitimate thing, is like, no matter what the content that you're able to consume is, if it's not connecting with you on a personal level, it's gonna have equal effect. So.
Do you mind? Can I can I ask you about what recently? You don't have to go into detail, but I feel like there's been something in your life lately that's made a difference, and it's the first time in our relationship that I have seen you actually connect with something on a personal level, and I think that's a valid thing.
I guess that's true. We recently, or at least not we, I recently have joined part of this kind of small multi-denominational men's group that meets on a weekly basis. And it's nothing, extravagant. There's not really a big agenda. It's, a lot of it is just a lot of prayer, and it's an opportunity for, we work with a majority of the people that are in the group, but it's just an opportunity to kind of come on a social level, on a different outside of work, to have conversations that are intentional of, whatever you're struggling with, if it's, anxiety, if it is, health concerns or whatever it may be, and then just kind of having that opportunity to bring it to somebody and just share in a non-threatening or just kind of a non-awkward group, just having that opportunity to kind of come with whatever's on your heart. And then kind of the big thing that we've done recently that's really been impactful for me is we've actually had
Sorry.
You're good. We've had individualized prayer for everybody, and each of us have had an opportunity to just kind of have that bonding moment. And I never really, I don't know, prayer, I mean, obviously something that we've all talked about, and we know it's important to have the connection with God. But when we've had these prayer groups or whatever, it's definitely, I could feel the lift coming off of my shoulders. I could feel wow, I'm not the only one that struggles with this, or, what, it just, I think knowing that someone else is there praying for you and lifting you up in that way, I think has been really impactful. And it's also just been an opportunity and ideation group as well, as just talking about what their dreams are and what they want for their local church and things like that. So it's been really cool.
That's interesting. What do you think the difference is the environment of it being a small group? Because we were talking about, if you guys listened a couple episodes ago, where we were talking about, I'm talking to the audience. Because I know you didn't. No, I'm just kidding.
We're catching up. We're just behind.
We were talking about what is the purpose of corporate worship, like the church service itself. And that's something that I have struggled with, because usually I'll enjoy a small group or a Bible study or something, but the church service itself is something that I really have a hard time benefiting from in a meaningful way. So that's my next question is, do you guys feel like your experience is a common experience, or do you feel like you're outliers? For people of our generation, we're talking NAD because let's be honest, different countries don't have the same struggles that we have here in the States. But for our generation, for your peers, do you feel like this is a common experience, or do you feel like you're an outlier?
I think for our church especially, we've talked about, we lack that fellowship atmosphere of, we come to Sabbath school, we sit in our pews, we go to church, we sit in our pews, and there's not really a whole lot of interaction. But when we have opportunities like the Sabbath school breakfast, or we have this small men's group, that we have an opportunity to kind of connect on a different level, and it feels more real and personalized to what, our daily struggles may or may not be. One of the topics that came up recently was talking about how, I guess the early church is probably the only way to describe it. It was really about, meeting in people where they're at, in their homes, in a small group level. It wasn't, putting this preacher or this speaker up on a platform and having him, kind of talk down to us, and that's how we receive the message. It really is kind of a one-to-one conversation of, what's on your heart today, and meeting them where they needed to kind of seek help from. And so I think there's something about religion, and when you talk to someone in their own home where they're comfortable, I think can really have the biggest impact for them.
Well, I just wanted to add on to that and to say the biggest reason that I wanted Graham to share that whole experience also, which I know this doesn't exactly answer your question, but the reason that I wanted him to share that is you and I, Emily, have had a lot of discussions about, like, what do we do practically? Like, whether we're stranded in the middle of nowhere or whether we're stranded in an Adventist mecca and not finding our fit, how do we change it? Because I think we all have this, not all of us, but I'm talking all of us that are on this podcast today, and I'm sure a lot of you listening have felt the same thing of, okay, I want this in my life, but how do I practically do that? And I thought it was really, Graham's experience has been really cool to watch because, like I said, this is the first time that I've seen him have a reaction to something like this in our whole relationship. And like he said, they didn't pick a book. They didn't say, we're going to go through a book, or let's study the book of John, or there's no real format even. They just said, we want this to be intentional, and we want there to be a spiritual component. And they literally just get together and talk about what they're going through. And first of all, I think it's amazing that Graham even shared they've had talks about, like, mental health and stuff. And there aren't a lot of men these days that will have those conversations. So kudos to them even just for that. But then they've also been intentional about weaving spiritual elements into it and about having that prayer time. And so I just thought that was really encouraging, because we've had times where it's like, okay, but who do I ask to be in a small group, and how do I do that? And so it's just been encouraging to me to say, like, sounds so cliche, but just do it. Like, just find a couple friends and say, we're going to commit to having some prayer time and keeping a spiritual mentality. But other than that, like, you don't have to have it all figured out to be able to get together and grow. And I think that's the biggest thing that I wanted to bring up, which again doesn't really answer your question about church, but I think that if you're in a place where you're struggling and you're thinking, but I don't know how to do intense Bible study, or I don't know what book should we go through, like, it doesn't have to be that. Just get together and help each other and pray for each other.
Do you think we are on a podcast, this is a digital sort of space, do you think that this type of thing can be as effective in a digital space as it can be in person? There's kind of an online community sort of growing of Adventist type digital things happening. And so there is a question out there. Can we create sort of almost digital churches where people can find community with people that they have things in common with? Is there an element, do you think, that we'll miss out on if we don't do those things in person?
Yes, and yes, and yes, and yes. No, again, you and I have had these talks. I feel like I do think there's a potential for that, for, like, community via something like this. I think the struggle is, like, okay, for instance, like, I just embarrassingly admitted I'm, like, Emily's biggest fan of this, and yet I'm a couple weeks behind. And so there will be times where I'm listening to an episode of your podcast, and I'll be like, oh, I have a thought about that, and yet I'm weeks behind. And not that I can't, like, comment to you, but I think that there's that lag time where it's hard to have a discussion. But something that I have thought about too is, like, I feel like there's an opportunity to have something like this where, for instance, somebody gets on a podcast and talks, and then maybe a day later in the week there's a digital group that, like, discusses not the lesson, but, the talk, like, right, where we kind of share our thoughts. And, like, because I know I've heard you say, like, okay, if you have feedback, email me or tweet me or whatever, I want to hear from you. And yet there's that lag time where I think other people have probably thought this too, of, like, oh, well, the issue's passed, like, I don't need to say anything. And so I do think you would miss the element of, I really benefit from being able to, like, see somebody face to face. But I don't think that doesn't mean that there's not a place for it, because I feel like I really benefit from just listening to you talk to other people on this. And then if there was some way to, I've actually even thought when you said stuff like that, like, man, could we have some kind of, like, live stream after the podcast where people can, like when somebody will do a Facebook live sale, mm-hmm, and you can, like, comment in, and mm-hmm, even though you're not actually talking, like, you could at least be reading people's comments. Or I think something like that would be very beneficial and make me feel like, oh wow, there's somebody else somewhere else going through the same thing. So even though it wouldn't have the same value as face-to-face, I think it has a definite place and benefit.
So what do you think is sort of the biggest problem plaguing the church as an institution right now?
I think the struggle to adapt. I'll just take it from kind of the worldview as a whole. Over the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen such great jumps in technology, in how we communicate, in the amount of information that we have. And you see so many different companies that are adapting to meet those people where they are and to attract that other generations or that new generation. And I think the church has been the same 50 plus, 60 plus years in how it's structured. You have your special music, you have your scripture for the day, and then you have your sermon. And that's, in general, probably how a vast majority of the Adventist churches operate. And I think it's, especially with the millennial generation, I think it's not speaking to us as much as it may have our parents' generation. And that's probably tied to why we have so many people that relatively grew up in the church, and then once it's time for them to make their own choice, they don't attend anymore.
So what you're saying is Adventism is the Blockbuster of church.
Oh my word. We need Netflix.
Hollywood Video.
No, it's Hulu. And I just want to leapfrog off that though, and something that I've noticed as well is not only like the technological changes, but I think it's a real struggle to find. I think probably one of the biggest obstacles that our church as an organization is having is how to meet everyone in the middle. Because I feel like, okay, so we decide to make things, switch up the service and change what's included and all that stuff. And the millennials are like, yeah. And then some of the older generations are like, now I'm not getting a blessing. And so I feel like it's easy. Like you go to either extreme service and the opposite generation is going, well, there's nothing in this for me.
Your time is over, old people.
That's the real message we have on this podcast. No, but yeah, like how do we engage the millennial generation? And I'm not even talking about offending older generations. I just mean, I know how I feel when I sit through some of those, what people would call boring church services, and I think, I'm not getting anything out of this. But I've heard from older generations who are not even offended by like praise songs and things like that, but it's not what they're used to, and so it's not what they connect with. So even if they're open to change, it's hard for them to feel spiritually fulfilled in newer settings. And so I think finding a way to bridge the gap of, do we do like some churches and have separate church services, or do we combine elements from each? Or I think that's a big struggle that we're facing.
Yeah. Okay, so we answered the question of the organization. What do you think is our biggest struggle as a generation in relation to the church?
I mean, my first answer, without thinking it over, and I don't know, I feel like I probably would have a more eloquent answer if I thought about it, but maybe I'll make this personal. For me, in my generation, a lot of it is selfishness, and I know that people could argue that, but I have found that in my marriage, I found that in my friendships, I found that in my relationship with church, when I'm so focused on, well, how am I going to get a blessing, or how am I going to get whatever, it's a lot bigger struggle. And I feel like our generation is a lot more, we talk about how we're instant gratification, we talk about how I want what I want when I want it, and when you go to church and you're not getting what you feel like whatever it is in your head you should be getting, well, why should I even be here? And I know we could go into the whole debate of, well, is, like you said the episode a few weeks ago, well, is church really valuable? And so I'm not saying it's only selfishness, but I know that's been a big thing I've seen with me and my friends is if it isn't exactly catered to a T to what we want, we're out. Mm-hmm. So I think that our mentality, I guess, would be a better way of saying it than selfishness. But that's just the word that came to my mind. But our mentality of what's in it for me. And not that we should have to do all the work, but I think if we found a more compromised, like, okay, how can we work together to make changes? We need changes, but instead of, well, it wasn't exactly what I wanted, so I'm out.
Yeah, right.
What do you think, Graham? Sorry.
I think it's very similar to what you said about just the mentality. I think that as a generation, we're very probably prone to and the only word I could think of, but it's not the right word, standing up for our beliefs. And so we have lots of people our age that are starting their own not-for-profits, or they're doing the kind of whatever cause or charity really speaks to them. And so I think we're really all about how can we make this hands-on and mold it to us. And so it's moving away from that typical kind of classroom feel that that churches have to, I'm going out and serving the homeless, or
the church that you and I felt connected to was more of a Bible study than a church, like traditional church feel. It was more of a kind of discussion, more of a large, small group kind of.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that's valid. And I totally cut Graham off. Can I also add that another conversation I've had with Emily, I've had it with a lot of my friends, is, without going into detail because everybody's experience is different, but I think a lot of us in this generation have struggled with what we'll just classify as making mistakes, and that can be as simple as, I watch movies that the church wouldn't agree with, or I've struggled with real issues, like I've had friends who've struggled with drinking.
Watching movies is not a real issue.
It's the biggest issue. but whether it's a smaller like lifestyle choice, or whether it's what the Adventist church would classify as a big issue of drinking or things like that, most, not all, sorry friends to call you out, but most of my friends and myself have struggled with some form of an issue of, I know the church wouldn't approve the church.
Unapproved.
Exactly, an unapproved activity. And so it's easier to hide that and avoid church rather than because if we are honest about those things, we're ostracized because, I don't struggle with that. Yeah. Now, I'm not going to tell you the 10 other things I do struggle with. Right. And so I feel like it's easier for our generation to be like, I'm going to feel judged. Whether they're being judged or not, we hide what we're really going through, and then it's easier to just hide in general. Yeah. I think is a real thing, too.
Although I would say that is a huge barrier for our generation, although I think it's also just part of the human condition.
Totally.
I think that's been a problem for a long time, which leads me to my last question. Do you think that this is a hazard of our stage in life? Do you think a lot of our generation will come back around? Because I know that at our age, our parents, a lot of people in our parents' generation did the same thing. They left, and many of them eventually came back. Do you think it is specifically a problem that we're having in the church that's causing people to leave, or do you think it's also a hazard of this is where we're at in our lives, and every generation kind of goes through it, and maybe we'll come back around at some point?
I never thought of it that way. I mean, we hear of countless examples of where, I guess the only way to put it is they did the more worldly thing, and then they had a moment where they hit rock bottom, and the thing that brought them back was Jesus. And so maybe that is, where our generation will head at some point, but it's hard to say that's what obviously that's probably our hope.
Yeah.
But, we're looking
we haven't hit rock bottom yet.
Well, for some people it's rock bottom. For my parents, it was having kids. And I know that sounds kind of, some life change, whether it's hitting rock bottom, whether it's for them, they didn't go to church for almost 10 years. And then they had me and we're like, this is important. We want this for our kids. And we're faithful churchgoers after that. I do think the difference with this generation, and this could just be my opinion, but I do think the difference is we are, I don't even know how to, because yes, I think there will be some people that go through exactly what you're saying and they stray or whatever and they come back. I do think there are more people from what I've seen, and maybe I just didn't live through the other generation, who question even if Adventism is beneficial, even though I haven't struggled with that. I have a lot of friends who have, and so I think I feel like I will see more of my friends come back to Christianity than to Adventism, or they may come back to Adventism, but if you were to ask them, why are you an Adventist? They really would, how am I trying to say this? They would relate more to nominal Christianity. They just go to Adventism because it's the title they grew up with. Yeah. If you looked at and I'm not judging their lifestyle choices, but if you look at their lifestyle choices, their fundamental beliefs, they probably don't really have much to relate to Adventism. That's the culture they grew up in. Yeah. So I feel like we'll see more come back to Jesus, which is what's, I think, ultimately important, but I don't know. I don't know if we'll see a return to fundamental Adventism as much in this generation.
We'll come back to movies, but not Blockbuster.
Yeah,
thank you for your insight and your story. Is there any last thoughts, last words you'd like to share before we leave everyone hanging and sad because it's come to an end?
I would like to say thank you for having us on your podcast. I think that what you're doing is really critical for this generation and this time, and these are real discussions. And I guess that's what I'd like to say is I think that people don't realize how open you are to having discussion and having different opinions on your podcast. And so I would just encourage people, like, if you have an opinion or a story or whatever, reach out to Emily, and whether that means you get to be on the podcast or get to be mentioned on the podcast or whatever you're lucky enough to attain. No, but I think that I want to just encourage people to have more real discussions and not worry that they're too conservative or too liberal, but to actually have these conversations, because I think that is how our generation is going to grow and find more Jesus.
And if I don't like it, I'll just silence you.
Exactly. So what do you have to lose?
We'll just filibuster is what it is.
You'll just be publicly humiliated or...
So good!
So thanks for having us, Emily.
Yeah,
Yes, thank you.
Thanks for being willing to share. All right, thanks everyone. Have a good week.